Hi, folks. My name is Josh. Some people know me as Fergoff, if you know me within the magical community. This presentation was originally presented at the 2023 Mid-Atlantic Gather. If you're a Gardnerian or you're hooked up with a Coven, you're probably welcome to come along. Certainly the 2024 Mid-Atlantic Gather, I'm looking forward to it. But I like to talk about either totally fun off-the-wall stuff. Last year we did a Nokian Pictionary where we pretended to be John Dee. This year I want to talk about High Magic's Aid. I think from a pagan perspective, you should be clued into what Gardnerian wicca is about. And the best way of figuring that out is by reading Gerald Gardner and reading the public information that's out there in the books. If you're Gardnerian yourself, I think that it's important to go back and every degree that you get, from your first degree to the last degree, you should go back and read Gerald Gardner's books. There's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and you'll notice it once you're in and you've had the opportunity to experience the mysteries and you've had the opportunity to work your way through the ritual. And there's stuff in there that's just fun for pagans. High Magic's Aid is interesting and difficult to place, right? If you read the book, especially if you come from the ceremonial magic community, which is my background, you say, what's all this Christian stuff in here? What did Gerald Gardner mean by that? And some people have that knee-jerk reaction to Christianity. It's wronged them, or their church has wronged them, or they've been injured by a family member or something like that, and they read High Magic's Aid and they say, how does this have anything to do with Wicca? Right? So we can't just put it on the shelf. I think that's what I did for a lot of years. That was my coming into it, was sort of being angry at Christianity and having problems with that. And the book just sat on the shelf. I read the book. It was like, this is a great fantasy novel. I have no idea what Gerald meant by this. And yeah, just go away. Take the Christian stuff away. Gerald had, I think, a reverence for Christianity. I don't think he wanted you to be Christian. I don't think that he thought that Christianity was accurately represented in the modern state of the church. We're going to talk a lot about that in the following slide deck. We're going to talk about maybe the wink wink nudge nudges in the slide deck, although I won't call them out because the slide deck is also suitable for pagans. So if somebody in the Gardnerian community sent you this video and you're a pagan, hopefully it speaks to you and hopefully you thank them for sending it your way. Contact information and citations will be at the end of this video. It should come into about an hour and a half, somewhere in there. This format's a little bit difficult for me because I'm somebody who really enjoys audience interaction and talking with the audience and pointing to things on the screen, but I can't do that. I'm in this little box down in the corner, so it is what it is. So going all the way back to placing High Magic's Aid and figuring out where the intersection is between Wicca and Christianity and who's influencing who, we've got to go all the way back. We are going to time travel back to the first people to walk the earth. Sounds fun, right? All journeys begin with wonder. That's how I got into Wicca. That's how I said, hey, maybe there's something more out there in terms of spirituality. There's, something to be experienced. There's something to be learned from all of this. Whether you go outside and you just look at the stars and fall in love with the night sky, or you're, having a Steve Ranella moment where you just have to know what's over the next hill, or you just appreciate these standing stones in the last light of day and feeling the warmth of the earth. These are all pagan experiences. These are the things that I think inspired religion. Certainly, it's the root of all religion for myself. That's how I got into it. I absolutely love nature. I love being outside. I do a lot of, hiking, hunting, and fishing. It's a very pagan experience, right? And I think that all journeys do begin with wonder, and that's what inspired our first people to actually start exploring religion and thinking about what happens. And so our first principles are that you, from the perspective of Fred Flintstone or some other early person, right, you can't make the rocks and the trees. These things exist outside of yourself, but somebody has. And you can't make light and darkness or the movement of the heavens, but somebody can. You can't make the cycles of the seasons, but somebody can. You can't make the hunt successful, but somebody can. You can't make more or less animals, but somebody can. You can't make the forage increase or decrease, but somebody can. And so wherefore are the gods, and how do I please them for what they govern, and how do they punish them for what they lack? These are the things that are going through primitive man's head. Primitive man measures everything by what's around him. He measures everything by what's in arm's reach. He measures everything by very human units when you think about these things. So when you're measuring things, right, we, especially in America, right, we measure things in feet for our distance. We just quite simply pace them off. And if we need a smaller unit, maybe we use a thumb, right, for an inch, or a big toe if you're French royalty, right, or an arm's length, or the height of a peasant if you know about Russian artisans, as a distance of measurement. All of these units of measure and all of the movement of the heavens are charted by very human measurements, right? If you've been through Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, or you've done any outdoor courses, they'll tell you, if you need to know how long it takes for that sun to set, you hold your arm out at arm's length and you count how many fingers between the horizon and the sun. Each one of those fingers is 15 minutes. So this doesn't even apply to just people units, right? Measuring distances. This applies to even the passage of time. That's something that's going to be important to think about, like, as we go along. So, primitive man starts by examining the physical world around him. He starts by examining his own body. And we have two passages here that I want to cite. Ye shall be naked in your rights, from the charge of the goddess. And then, even in the Bible, very early on in Genesis, we have Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. So if you say, wow, this is starting to speak to me as origins and our origin story, that's exactly it. These have common roots, and these roots are present in every bit of mythos, not just the Bible, not just the Quran, but even going back as far as ancient Egypt and Babylonia, we find similar sentiments, that there's no shame in being naked, and that people are naked in their rights, just as a religious feature. So I put the citation up there on Hadrian's Wall, circa 122 AD. I knew that my kids were going to look at that and be like, Dad, why are you drawing penises on the wall? Well, it's for a reason. Drawing penises is really mankind's national pastime. It is the earliest piece of artwork that we find, or one of the earliest pieces of artwork that we find. And it's also almost universal. I mean, you can find this symbol anywhere you like, right? Anywhere you look. Now, the second thing that we have, fetching back to antiquity, is the Latin word for tail, which is penis. Usually I ask the audience to call it out because somebody's really awkward about the word. But that applies to any appendage which hangs off the body, and that gives us a hint as to the origins of the horns as a symbol of power, right? And so primitive man is going to be looking at what he's eating, what he's chasing around, those sorts of things. And in Europe, at least, the most popular game next to the pig was the deer, right? And the deer in particular is seen as holy because it's got these two very erect appendages on its head. And in fact, man can worship the cycle of time, and man can relate to it, because when the deer are getting ready to start rutting, when they're getting ready to reproduce, and when they're getting ready to have that cycle of fertility, you see the deer's antlers grow and they swell up, and they swell up under these velvety appendages. And so man, looking around, first looks down, and then he looks at the deer and he says, well, I can relate to this, right? As we move forward into the fall, into the height of the mating season, right, these appendages are used to signal the deer's sexual maturity, and it's also used to signal sexual preference, right? The deer with the biggest rack is also typically the alpha male, and it's the dominant one, and it's the one that's getting all of the love from the ladies, right? And man realizes that this is a potent symbol. It's not just about the deer's antlers, it's about the size of the thing, right? And then as we move into wintertime, the antlers fall off. I don't know whether primitive man said, hey, well, where did all the boy deer go, or something like that. Maybe he didn't know, maybe he did, he probably knew. But the antlers become flaccid, and they eventually fall off and droop to the ground. So it's not just the fact that these antlers are present, it's the fact that they are erect, right? And somehow the celestial bodies are the same. They're held erect. They're held so high up that man cannot reach them. And it gets man thinking about what's happening up there. And it gets man thinking about the cycles, and it gets man thinking about the fertility of the deer and the game and of himself and of the, the women that he's interacting with. Primitive man also understands the cycle of transformation. And so what we also find in a lot of cave art is things like the depictions of urination on the skins after these animals are hunted. And primitive man is not worshipping the urine, right? There's no urine goddess there. But what we see is the act of transmutation and the act of transformation, right? And so if you're playing the parallel game with Christianity, you would hear that it was the blood and body of Christ. If you're from the Egyptian pantheon, it's the same thing. There's transmutation when one of the gods is chopped up and thrown into a river. And we see this a lot, right? This is a theme. It's transformation. It's not the thing itself. Like, there's no bottle of urine that they're worshipping. It's the use of that into transforming the skins of these animals into leather. So what other cycles is primitive man aware of? And, we don't have, and I'm going to say this a lot, we don't have a manual for what these wall arts mean, right? They exist, and we know that they were important to primitive man, but there's no books written. There's no language yet at this point, right? The only thing that we have are these cave paintings, like this one that's found in France, right? And for all that we can understand, or all that we can draw meaning from, looking back and guessing, is that primitive man was paying attention to the seasons, right? This depicts the seasons. It depicts the motion of the heavens. It depicts reproduction when read left to right. We just assume that it's supposed to be read left to right. And then it depicts hunting, and then it depicts the winter time, right? And so primitive man is definitely thinking about cycles at this point. He's leaving us depictions of that sort of thing in the wall art. And that sort of idea carries forward. But here we have another very popular theme in the wall art, and that is the finest pornography that primitive man could produce, right? So primitive man is aware that mating happens. He's aware that there is sexual intercourse. He's aware that there is pregnancy. And then he's aware that there is birth. And so this leads to the most holy and the most worshipped and the most depicted theme in the evolution of religion, and in the evolution of society, and in the evolution of mankind, right? It is fertility. Because primitive man knew very quickly that if he can't find someone to copulate with, his tribe's going to die out, his family's going to die out. He knew that if he could find somebody to copulate with, it was within the realm of the gods whether there was a pregnancy that resulted. And so for primitive man, the first worship and the first real thing that he probably prayed for was pregnancy and that family and building the tribe and more people to help, right? He doesn't know anything about anything else. It's just that, right? It's just that simple act. And that's why fertility is the center of all early religions. I think it's the center of Gardnerian Wicca. I think it's the center of Christianity. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But he knows that something else needs to happen. And that's why the corn goddess is originally the pig goddess, right? Because there's that transition from hunting and gathering to farming, right? And other cultures, within other cultures, it could be the deer goddess going over to the agricultural goddess, that sort of thing. But for that to happen, there has to be that fertility. And the same thing goes with the crops. In order for those crops to grow, there has to be that fertility. That fertility is that cornerstone. With Gardnerian Wicca, it's the cornerstone of all foundation religions. It's the cornerstone of all the things that we're going to talk about today. So keep it in your head. And this doesn't mean that there's not other types of sexual contact depicted. That doesn't mean that anything is looked down upon, or that there's this shame, or that there's this deviancy. There are other things that we see that get depicted in cave art. I think, and again, there's no written manual. There's no, this is what I meant by that. Fred Flintstone didn't carve us a book and say, this is what I mean when I'm making this painting. This is just us looking at it from our lens, from our modern lens on the internet. But this depicts, I think, homosexual contact on the left, acknowledging that that exists and that that is sex, and on the right, God only knows what that means. I mean, that fellow really loves deer, is all I get out of that. But I haven't tried that, but maybe he did. Maybe he was trying to make the deer grow. Maybe he was just looking for a good time. We don't really know what they meant, aside of, I really love deer. But we also live in an age where there's not this idea of domesticated livestock back then. I mean, man is still in his hunter-gatherer mode in the period of time that we're in, which is depicting this sort of sexual contact. The observation of time is not something that occurs to primitive man. I don't even think it is something that occurs to modern man. Like, when you put on water to boil in the kettle, you don't care how long it takes to boil. You're just looking for that transformation. And it's no different from when primitive man was urinating on skins to make them into leather. The same thing when you're looking for a cool drink. You don't say, hey, oh, darn, it's going to take 4 hours for my water to freeze. You don't care, right? All you care is that you get that ice cube. And so primitive man is not looking for these subtle changes. He's looking for these obvious, gross changes in his environment, in him, in the world around him. And I think that that's something that we do even today, right? The reincarnation cult, on that note, isn't something that would come much later. So if Fred and Barney are hanging out and Barney gets waxed by a T-Rex, and then 20 years later, Barney comes back and communicates to Fred that, hey, it's me, Barney, I think I've reincarnated. Barney doesn't look the same way Barney used to. I think that that idea would have been just dismissed out of hand, even though it's a theme. I think that the cornerstone is definitely the fertility cult, no matter how you choose to interact with your spouse or your mate or anything like that, or your partner. Critically missing from all of those other depictions of sexual acts is this notion of time. And so this is a cave painting, and I don't have any Spanish, I'm sorry. Sierra de Capiveira National Park, Brazil. It's dated to 10,000 years ago. And again, I think that this is a depiction of events over time. And so how did primitive man measure time, right? It could have been something like filling a cup for, a slow amount of time or whatever. But I think that it's much more likely that he was observing the heavens. And so what we have on this drawing is specifically the top center there. We've got 9 of these circular, shiny objects. And I really do believe that he's saying, hey, this is the fertility cycle of these animals. They're fertile for 9 months out of the year. They can have up to 2 pregnancies a year. Each pregnancy can result in 3 offsprings, especially if we're talking about white-tailed deer. This is a measure of time. It's education for his children. It's education for the people to come after him. In the bottom left, I'm not even going to count it, but it does look like a family to me, and it looks like the people are getting bigger. And then on the right-hand side, we see the slaughter of the deer, the processing of the deer, those sorts of things. But curiously, we see figures that have been rubbed out. And it really makes me wonder if the left was how long someone important lived, and the right was how long they had been gone, or how long they'd had a new family, or something like that. It's a little bit sad to think about, but I think that these are markers of celestial events, specifically the day or the night, who knows, and how many months it would take, and the cycles of the moon, and that sort of thing. They're paying attention to the heavens. If you read Hamlet's Mill, and I suggest that you do read it, and it'll be in the citation, there's an argument that the observation of the heavens goes back to antiquity, and it starts with the observation of the sun for the period of the day, and a moon for the period of a month, a 28-day cycle, and then it goes on to talking about mapping these celestial bodies, and how primitive man told time by observing those sorts of things. All right, so first principle, she looks very happy. This is a 30,000-year-old petrified ritual instrument. Ritual instrument. It's funny that we know that. I don't know. I think she knows what it's for. But what I want to say is cycles are self-sustaining, repetitive. They occur over time. Cycles are not one-time events. It's not something that just happens. It's something that happens over and over and over again. And there's a waning and a waxing, and there's this movement. Things are happening, right? And they're happening over and over again. And it's not just a one-time event. I think that a piece of philosophy that's interesting to think about is the goddess or the goddesses are oftentimes depicted as the flower garden, the thing that contains all growth, and it's a fairly static thing. The goddess wants things to remain in their beauty. I mean, if you've ever held a baby and you've heard your wife say, I hope you stay like this forever. I hope she doesn't watch this video. I hope you stay like this forever. That's very much goddess thinking. And the god instead is the flowers inside of the garden. He's change. He's birth. He's death. He's the change of the cycles. So you could even think of the goddess as the cycle itself, and the god as the components which make up the cycle, right? It's there's a lot of deep philosophy in there. There's one of the wink wink nudge nudges for you should think about that later. But if we fast forward away from our hunter-gatherer roots and we start talking about the observation of agriculture and even pre-agriculture, things like mistletoe, I picked mistletoe because everybody thinks of mistletoe around Christmas, right? What do you do under the mistletoe? You kiss under the mistletoe. And so that tells you what a lot of people are doing during the year, especially among primitive mankind, right? There's game to hunt, but not really. Most things have migrated south. There's nothing to gather. You're eating your stores. You're sitting around. And honey, we've just got to pass the time somehow. Darn. So I think we all know what happens 9 months later. But anyway, the mistletoe myth itself is really an exercise in sympathetic magic. The mistletoe berries, if you squeeze them, they burst. They put white, gross stuff all over your hand. You can just kind of fill in and connect those dots yourself, kids. Ask your parents if you're under 18 if you can research that. And it acts a lot like semen. It's very easy to make that jump to, this is a sexual fluid. Within that, the mistletoe seeds themselves anchor themselves to a wound in the tree. A wound, right? I'll let you all fill in that one. And then the mistletoe emits a root from that seed through the sticky substance and embeds itself in that tree, right? You're literally talking about the pregnancy function. If you've read Varg Vikernes' Paganism Explained, he's a controversial character, but he writes really good books. Paganism Explained talks about this in depth. You can literally think of it as a fertilized embryo making its way to the womb and implanting itself in the lining of the womb. I don't know that ancient man knew that, but I think that that's the reason why it's an enduring myth, is because there's an element of truth to it, right? I think that's why all of these things are enduring myths, and they all speak to us as pagans. So to sum up the fertility cult, these are the things that we take as facts. Sex happens, babies are made, nobody really knows where souls come from or why things are alive. Seasons happen, cycles happen, families makes life easier, there's an urge to procreate beyond just simply the fun of sex. Eventually things die, and then there's some bullet points that we don't know, and then we do it all again. And so this is the fertility cult, right? The cycle would be broken if there was no fertility, if there was no reproduction, and certainly life and death are parts of it. But the cycle itself is what keeps us going forward, right? So now we have to intersect with Christianity, and I strongly believe that everybody is copying everyone's homework, but importantly, all of the religions that come after the fertility cult, that original cult, that ancestral cult, they're copying our homework. And later, we're going to go copy their homework. And so the reason why they're copying our homework is because this new fellow shows up, and it's about, Christ wasn't born on 0 AD. That's just a date of convenience. It was probably sometime around 80 AD. Really, the Gospels and the writing doesn't show up for another couple of hundred years, and then it gets kind of formalized at somewhere around 600 AD. But dates aside, this new guy shows up. He's not royalty like us. So if you're a pagan and you're being ministered to and somebody's trying to tell you about this Jesus Christ, they can't start with, well, he's God. Because you're going to say, no, he's not. I don't buy that. You need to go away, get out of my field. I'm farming here, right? So he's not royalty. He's not a god. He's not a king. He's not nothing. When Jesus is being pitched to the poor pagan folk, he's just pitched as a normal fellow. He's born and he dies and he reincarnates. And that resonates with a lot of people. That's not new religious thinking. Christianity is copying the Jewish thought. The Jewish thought is copying the Egyptian thought. The Egyptian thought is copying the Babylonian thought. The Babylonian thought is copying the Zoroastrian thought. It just goes on and on and on, where everybody's copying each other's homework. The important part to keep in your brain is it all started with that fertility cult. So he hangs out with 12 other people like us. That 12 number is pretty significant. Probably appeals to people who are involved in some sort of witchy stuff. He claims his dad is a god, just like Zeus and Mithras. This isn't anything new. He goes fishing like us. He does, right? He's a hunter and fisher and gatherer. He does that kind of stuff. He's got problems with thorny bushes. Well, we think about thorns too, don't we? We've got pointy things on our heads too with our gods, right? That seems to be okay. And the government doesn't really like him. I don't think that primitive man was terribly interested in the government, and I think that there was a little bit of wink, wink, nudge, nudge there, because as we're going to find out, Christianity just kind of goes off the rails, right? I don't think many people were kind of happy with that. So, I think that there's two Christianities, and we're going to get into this a bit. We're going to expand on this too. There is what we see in the fertility cult, and we see this as a worship of the fertility process and all the things that goes with it, with love and with raising a family and with just loving your neighbor, those sorts of things. And if we fast forward to Rumi and we say, hey, is that a strain of thought that has survived? The answer is yes, it has, right? Rumi is this poet. He speaks Persian, Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. He was a polyglot. And he writes really beautiful poetry, and I think it's that glimpse into the idea that the fertility cult survived Christianity, right? Here's somebody who's working out of the Middle East, and he's got really beautiful poems, and he's writing them to God, right? And the fertility cult is a love letter, right? A moment of happiness. You and I sitting on the veranda, apparently two, but one in soul, you and I. We feel the flowing water of life here, you and I, and the garden's beauty and the birds singing. The stars will be watching us, and we will show them what it is to be a thin crescent moon. When you think about that, that's a really neat observation, because something is laying on top of the moon. Something is making love to the moon. You and I are unselfed and will be together, indifferent to idle speculation, you and I. The peacocks of heaven will be cracking sugar as we laugh together, you and I, in one form upon this earth, and another form in a timeless, sweet land. And so here we have a love letter, and we have fertility, and we have reincarnation, and we have all of these themes in here. If you do read Rumi, be careful to get one with an interleaved translation and take the time to research it. The peacocks is oftentimes mistranslated as parrots, and the German edition, the Merkur publications, are typically superior to the other ones that are floating around out there. And then we say, did magic survive, right? Did the fish cult actually preserve anything? And there's going to be a link to the slide deck under the video. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but what I do want to point out is not only did magic survive, not only is this manuscript from 500 AD written for a magic spell for a woman's love, right? But it's written in 2 languages. And so not only was magic something that was normal, not only was it something that was practiced, but by 500 AD, people could write spells in 2 languages and explain them in 2 languages. And if you've read the Picatrix, this sounds really normal. We know what they were writing because a lot of these were actually written on lead and tin, especially in the Roman territories. They were not written on papyrus, but this one happens to be written on papyrus. But for a woman's love, an effective charm, write these on a sheet of tin. The offering is a wild herb, froth from the mouth of a completely black horse, and a bat. Bury it at the woman's door. You will see its potency quickly. So she's either going to fall in love with you, or she's going to tell you that you are completely freaking nuts and you need to get out. One of those things will definitely happen quick. All right, so in Europe at least, if we get out of the Middle East, we have this character, Snorri Sturluson. And the secret here is that there's 2 kinds of Christianities. There's the Christianity, which is the fertility cult, which appealed to the pagan folk, and that's what the missionaries were using to sell Christ as a god. And there's the political Christianity, which comes through from 800 to 1200 AD, and its conversion by the sword. And I would love to say that pagans are peace-loving people and that there's never any problems, but the long and short of it is, after the Lindisfarne raids, after the sack of Paris, after the Great Pagan Army was formed, it's not true. Everybody's killing everybody. Take the romance out of it. That's just how history's made. The original Christianity is a fertility cult, right? It's different from the political Christianity. I don't even think that they sold the political Christianity to the common pagan folk, right? They took the fertility cult Christianity and they sold that, and they took the political Christianity and they said, if you guys don't convert, Rome is going to come here and chop your head off. That's basically what it is. Snorri is kind of fun because he writes Jesus into the most awkward of places. And so if you've read the Yngling Saga or the King's Scholar, they, Jesus, Odin and Thor are hanging out at the table and they're drinking their own med, and Jesus walks in, and Jesus has a glass of wine, and he starts, just basically shooting, talking to Odin and insulting. It's called flighting, but insulting Odin and kind of picking a fight and barring back and forth. And this is not the Jesus that we know, right? This is not the Jesus of the Bible. This is some other Jesus who has to act like a pagan god in order to garner that acceptance from the pagan folk, from the fertility cult. And so this is the Jesus of agriculture and wine, is what it is, right? Whether you want to call him Dionysus, whether you want to call him Bacchus, whether you want to say that he's the god of the field or whatever, he's just sort of this do-it-all god figure, and Snorri writes him into these Eddas. So, the fertility cult doesn't reject the Christ mythos. Christ just ends up on the shelf next to your Odin statue and your Thor statue and whoever else you have on there. But the fertility cult understands that Christ is a theophany of the horned god. Christ has these allegories to the horned god, and they say, well, maybe he's just another name for the horned god. Whether you call him Bacchus or Pan or anything like that, he's the same guy. He's just got a lot of names. This is also where we start seeing the emphasis on the femininity of the Christian church. And so one of the things that in Christian circles gets discussed a lot is, what was the role of Mary? The mother of Christ, right? And how did Mary come to exist? And why is it impressive that Mary was able to give birth to Jesus when nobody else could give birth to Jesus? And the answer is because something came from outside and set that cycle in motion, right? That's where the Christians get the idea that God came down and made Mary pregnant, right? You're not going to accidentally give birth to Jesus when you're baby making, right? Something had to come in here. And so I want you to look at this and say, is this in my Bible? Is this circle in my Bible? The answer is no, right? I mean, when we were giving this presentation with more people in the room, people were like, no, it's not in my Bible. I don't know what you're talking about. This didn't come from the Bible, right? And so what we have in High Magic's Age is this presentation of the esoteric threads that were contemporary to Europe. There's the fertility cult. There's Freemasonry. There's witchcraft. There's thaumaturgy. The theme that's missing for anybody who wants to accuse it of just being a study of the Lesser Key is the actual Lesser Key. There are themes borrowed from it, but if you've read the Skinner edition of Lesser Key, or you've read the Cotton manuscript that Mathers is working from, it's not there. Like, there's bits and pieces, there's shades of it, but it's not there. And so we have to look at this, and we have to think about what do we see? What speaks to us, especially as Wiccans? And, one of the things that we can say the Lesser Key doesn't have in it is, where's the position of that triangle, right? It's not the north. We see the north out there, right? We see that there's a notation for a doorway in the north, which is a practical consideration, but we see 4 sensors. We see 3 circles. The 3 circles should get your attention if you're Gardnerian. We see a particular symbol, and we see the Hebrew names of God. And what I want to posit is, this is a synthesis between existing witch practices and Christianity, which has started to move through Europe around the time, right? The names of God are there, but the names of the gods or the names of what's supposed to be represented by the pentagram, they're not. They're just written as shorthand. And if you're Gardnerian, this probably means something to you, but we're not going to talk about that in the video. The other nice thing about this is the triangle is present, but the triangle is not in the north the way the Lesser Key has it. The triangle is placed in the southwest. And if you read the book, it's because they're trying to summon Mars. And the only person who I've seen come up with this outside of Gerald Gardner is Poke Runyon in the OTA. And I'm a huge fan, and I'm also an OTA member. And he says that you should place the triangle where the planet's going to rise at the horizon. And again, this is a very pagan thing. We're not working with like, oh, okay, well, he governs the north and he's from the north, blah, 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 blah. We're saying we place the triangle where the planet's going to appear. We are looking through the triangle at the planet, and we're looking for the spirit. And that's a very important thing. It's a very practical thing. These are my 4 fingers to determine the sun thing. I'm using my thumb to measure an inch or a foot to measure a foot. The triangle is placed there because that's where the planet is. It's a very pagan influence that we find in this particular bit of high magic, right? So now we actually get into quoting the book. We only make it as far as page 5. We're not going to make it very far in here until later in the slide deck. But Tur answered slowly, there may be a way. He turned to Olaf and said sharply, you, hast thou loved a woman yet? A woman? I loved my mother when she was kind of totally goes over his head. Right? Not that, said Tur, hast thou ever cast eyes on a young girl with thoughts of love, or any other woman for that matter? Answer truly. The writing is fantastic. I want to read everything in that voice, right? Not me, said Olaf promptly. All girls be silly things. I have no use for any of them. Jesus Christ, right? All right, so what we're talking about is another theme out of magic, and we're talking about one of the fundamental forces in magic, and that's that very deep urge to reproduce, that very deep urge to have sex, that sort of thing. And importantly, this is something that we see all the way back to the Greek manuscripts where young child was used for a scryer, right? Somebody who doesn't have to deal with those urges, who doesn't have that full spiritual development yet that we get in adulthood as we go through puberty and sexual maturity. That's what he's looking for, right? He says, well, are you a suitable seer? Because you're not influenced by these things yet. And again, it's a nod to the fertility cult, right? It's a nod to, have you been with a woman or have you desired to be with a woman yet, right? And so now we're going to make a small detour because we have to talk about the authenticity of it, right? What is authentic Solomonic ritual? And if you talk to Aaron Leach, he's got his opinions on it. If you talk to the Gallery of Magic people, they have very different opinions on it. Some of them practical, some of them not. But what is Gardner saying if high magic say doesn't follow the lesser key? And I really do believe that there is a witch cult which incorporated Christian aspects. And it probably did intersect with Goetia when those manuscripts were moving through Europe. And so in 1531, we have the 3 books of occult philosophy, and it's essentially the Cliff Notes version of the Magica. So it's Summa Magica. It's Agrippa's notes on all of the magic that was all practiced everywhere, and he has some comments on it. Now the parts of ceremonial magic are Goetia, and Theurgia. Goetia is unfortunate by the commerces of unclean spirits made up of the rites of wicked curiosities, unlawful charms, deprecations, and is abandoned and extricated by all laws. So, 1531, there's been the split in magic. There's, magic that is Christian, and there's magic which is pagan. And the pagan magic, of course, is prosecuted because we've already gone through that Reformation, right? We've already gone into the political crap, frankly, that causes these problems, right? And so even before that, before Agrippa, we've got Peter di Bono. He's born in 1257, he dies in 1316. He's accused of witchcraft in 1305 for using magic to return money to his pocket. Now, if anybody has that spell, do not leave it in the comments. Comment via email privately directly to me. He has written Divineris, I can't even pronounce it, Aromandic Remedies. He has also written the Heptameron, and we're going to talk about that in a second. This was a book of Arabic magic concerning poisons, very similar to the Picatrix, contemporary to that period. Spirits we later find in Agrippa and later Solomonic works we see here. This is their first cataloging. Most spirit names can be rendered in Arabic languages the same way they can be rendered in Greek. There's no language overlap there. Most spirit hours can be predicted with Arabic astrology, right? This tells us that at some point, there was a catalog of magic. Magic was such a commodity thing that you can be prosecuted for it by how people practice law. You can be yelled at and said, like, hey, we're going to burn you at the stake because you're not following the teachings of the church. And there's a notion of good magic and bad magic. So there's that politics that's crept into things, right? It's really difficult to find the fertility cult here, but you'll get so far if you keep those first principles in mind. If you're looking for the Grand Key of Solomon the King in Arabic, it's written by Asif ben Berekaya. It's out of print. You'll have to find the PDF somewhere. But he renders all of the names in Arabic, right? This is basically his Cliff Notes, Peter Diabano's Cliff Notes of magic, right? He's also written the Heptameron. We mentioned that on the last slide. Magic had become so institutionalized that the Heptameron is essentially the Cliff Notes edition of summoning the spirits by the day of the week or of a season. And it is filled with ritual, it is filled with little notations, and it's filled with tables. And so if you've ever tried to read the 3 books of occult philosophy and said, I feel like I'm trying to read Webster's Dictionary to learn English, yeah. You're supposed to use it as a springboard of philosophy. You're supposed to use it like 777 as your Cliff Notes. But it's expected that you're coming into it knowing magic. And that's important because that means that magic has survived from before the formalization of Christianity in Europe. There were existing pagan practices that get painted over by Christianity, right? And again, we have these magic circles, we have these symbols. You should recognize the Agla from John Dee later. You should recognize that 6-pointed star with the seal of Saturn on it from later manuscripts. But they show up in the Heptameron first. And that belies that there was an earlier work that they drew from. There was an earlier existing magical practice of extant ritual that they drew from. Okay, so how do we build this stuff? Today we go down to Home Depot or whatever, or Lowe's or whatever, Sheets, whatever you shop at, whatever. Instruments, gasped the horrified Olaf. Jan gave an impatient half gesture which bade him to be silent and not interrupt. Without them there is much danger. Firstly, I must make a circle with a properly consecrated sword. How may one come of that? Asked Jan. It can be made, but the means are lacking, and that is the trouble. To make the sword, I need the Baron, and to make the Baron, I must have consecrated a white-hilted knife, the witch's athame. They, in turn, must be made by the Baron. Jan dripped hopelessly into his seat, sitting hunched with a bent head. Ter looked compassionately at him. 'Tis all a circle, and I know not the way in. So here we have it. We have thinking that, hey, there's a circle, there's a cycle. These cycles are important. There has to be a way in, and there has to be a way out. If you actually chart out the tools, that white-handled knife, the athame on the left, makes the Baron. The Baron is like an awl. It's basically a metal that's a sharp point. The Baron inscribes the sword. That's not something you can inscribe with a knife. You need a harder piece of steel to do it. And the sword makes the circle. But you can't cast a circle without a sword, can you? So all these things have to come from somewhere. How can we solve this problem, Jan? So we have this diagram. It's another place where Gardner gives us a freebie. We've got Hebrew names of God around it. We've got that pentagram tell that you've got to fill in the blanks for. Maybe you'll figure it out. But importantly, you've got a table, you've got a censer, which means that you've got incense, and you've got stools. And how many stools are there? There's 2 stools for working on the table. And why is that? Well, if you actually think about it, the reason why is because you need somebody who's got a sword to cast that circle, and you need somebody with either a white-handled knife or a Baron to make the next thing. And so you've got to enter this. And this is where Gardnerianism becomes an initiatory cult. The power is not just passed from God to you. The power is passed from male to female, right? There's the fertility nod. The power is passed from the high priest or the high priestess down to the initiate. And that's why there's 2 stools in the circle, because you need that existing set of tools to work with that other person to create the rest of the tools that you need. Gardner's drawn us a picture about this. It's not really talked about in the book, but the clues are there, and this is one of the big revelations to have. And so the names around the circle are cast as a resounding gong in the chapter from this diagram. True power lies in himself, Ter continued ruminating in tone, but he must have peace and quiet to inflame himself to the highest might of frenzy. How can he concentrate his will to draw down the most powerful force when one ear is cocked in fear of my Lord Abbot's men coming thundering at the door? A pox on all busybody priests, commented Jan. As for me, I cannot work in silence. To summon the spirits, be they in heaven or hell, I must call loudly, and I will do so. Will not the neighbors hear and go to the abbot straight away? And he loveth me not. And so they're concerned about the political Christianity not recognizing what they're doing as essentially a devotional act to the fertility cult, right? He says, we're not practicing lawful magic. Christianity is going to burn us at the stake. So at this point, we can look at who's actually talking. Who are the characters in High Magic's, or at least the main characters in High Magic's Aid, right? Gerald Gardner does editorialize in here. It's fairly obvious when he's doing it. But Yan is the talker, the reader, the chanter, the intellectualism. Tur is meditation, Eastern thought, he is mysticism. In fact, Tur has a large library, and he's sort of post book reading, post knowledge. He's moved into mysticism. Yen actually comments on his library at one point, and he's sort of this wild-eyed summer child getting into magic, and he says, "Well, I want to read your library." And Tur doesn't place much stock in books at this point. He's probably read them all, and he's into mysticism, and he says you can just have them. Morven represents seduction, intuition. Morven is really the center figure of the witchcraft, right? And so seeing how they're interacting with Morven and what she's doing, right? Some were there who would look into a pool of water or a magic stone and see visions of what was happening in a distance, and so we would be warned of approaching danger. By these means we escaped for long, though yearly, and as we grew weaker, so did the hatred of our enemies increase, so that they came with armed men to our gatherings to take us, but being forewarned, we would disperse when they arrived. They said it was the devil who warned us. So again, it's this... They've forgotten about the fertility cult. They've forgotten about paganism, and they've started to change things and say, it's not the horned god, it's the devil. These people are worshipping the devil. They're worshipping Satan. So, Thur seems to know about the witch cult from an academic perspective. This is where Gerald Gardner's kind of editorializing about his altar. "'Tis a phallic religion," said Tur, "and the broomstick symbolizes the phallus." There's a lot more that symbolizes the phallus, and there's a lot more that symbolizes the vagina. But all of these things are allegories. They're contained in there. They're important in their own rights. It's left to the reader to notice them. And so with that, Gardner also says there's different types of magic. There's different things that speak to us. With me in the beginning, it was the Milky Way over the standing stones in that photograph and sort of the awe of nature. But from the heights of the Hempstead, they looked across the fertile valley. Again, he uses the word fertile a lot because it's a fertility cult and he wants to tell you that. The fertile valley to the splendors of the great cathedral, revealed sharply by the crystalline air of that day, its surface glistening here and there as the sun caught upon some facet of the newly cut stone. They gazed in awe and wondered what man could devise and raise such an edifice, for in grandeur conception and beauty of craftsmanship, it had not equal anywhere. And this is really one of the myths of Freemasonry, right? This is basically saying that Freemasonry is a force. It comes out of the fertility cult, and at some point, man starts making more complicated worships that are going to inspire emotion, because emotional force is an important tenet of magic, right? Gardner uses the word fertility about 200 times in his writing. I have a list somewhere of all the times he did it. It's in the work citation if you want to click on it and just read about the word fertility 200 times, but it's obvious, right? "'Tis a marvel," breathed Morven, breaking the silence into which they had fallen and feasted their eyes. "It's the very symbol of God. Why cannot the Mother Church be as holy and gracious in her deeds towards men as she manifests herself in that great temple?" The church is referred to as female. Morven knows that the church springs forth from the fertility cult, and that by cutting the stone and making the changes to nature, that's the work of men who are building the great temple. "'Tis not a church," cheered the elder Bonder with supreme scorn. "'Tis the master mason and the men who build under him." Oh, okay, well, tell us it's Freemasonry without saying it's Freemasonry, right? "Nay, there is more. 'Tis eyes which we see, the grandeur, the vision, and the mind of the master, ere ever he begins to build." Yen stared at this, uncomprehending, while Tur smiled in satisfaction, and Morven nodded in agreement. So, Tur and Morven are really on the same page in terms of understanding magic and mysticism, right? Yen is still kind of this babe in the woods, right? He hasn't quite grasped it, but it's endearing, right? He's a nice guy. But this is a cycle unto itself. This number 3 comes up in many places. I believe that it's intentional. Morven's emotionalism, Tur is mysticism, Jan is intellectualism. Morven, and I don't have any Greek pronunciation, so I'm going to mangle it, and my Arabic is modern Persian, so I'm going to mangle it, right? You're just going to have to Google it yourself. But Morven is the epithymerticon and the alnafs alamara. Tur is mysticism, thymodes, alnafs alamutma'ina. Yan is intellectualism, the logiskon, alnafs alawawama. Now, Gerald, when he's in Malaysia, converts to Islam. And this is really, I think, where the observation of political religion and sincere religion comes into play, because he converts to Islam from another American who has converted to Islam and is doing the same thing he is in Malaysia. He's operating a rubber plantation, essentially, right? I think that he converts to Islam because he is interested in the mysticism of the people. And one of the fellows in the audience actually commented he's interested in their folk religions, and he's interested in converting to Islam to have access to those folk religions. I think that it was entirely political, because Gardner converts to Islam, he takes the Shahada, and then him and Cornwall just kind of go away. We don't hear from him anymore. I also believe that this was intentional. It was the gift of the gods, because later Gerald Gardner is able to go back to England and strike up this conversation with a Sufi mystic named Idris Shah, right? He also wrote Gerald Gardner Witch. It's credited to Jack Bracelin, but it's actually written by Shah. Jack Bracelin was also a member of New Forest Coven, but Shah uses his name because Shah is this Islamic person. He's politically sensitive, and he says, if I put my name on that, they're going to accuse me of practicing witchcraft. The logixicon in Greek is reason, or the desire to exert reason and make rational decisions. The thymades is the spirit, or the part of the soul that houses anger and other strong emotions. And the epithymidicon is appetite or desire, especially the part that desires physical pleasures such as food, drink, and sex. And then in the Islamic pieces, the al-mutmainah is the serene soul, which accepts the will of Allah and its graceful servant. It's mysticism, right? I just kind of accept what's happening. The al-walama is the reproachful soul, which overanalyzes things. If you think about Crowley's commentary on the knife or the athame, basically chopping things up into their component parts, but it's an act of destruction, this is where we're at. The alamara is the soul which incites evil through passions. It's a very modern Islamic take on passion, right? But it's their thought, and I think that Gardner probably bumped into those. Frederick Lamond, quoting Shaw, when I was interviewing Gerald, sometimes I wished I was a News of the World reporter. What marvelous material for an expose, and yet I have it on good authority that this group will be the cornerstone of the religion of a coming age, but rationally I cannot see it. And what's sort of striking about that is it's not the cornerstone of a religion of a coming age, it's remembering, right? Our fertility cult has preserved itself through reincarnation, and it was able to go through time and find these touchstones and find these eternal truths and preserve them. Right, so the meeting of the three. Again, you mock, but you should make some small spell for Yen's special safety, a spell of invisibility. And this is where we get into Gardner talking about science intersecting with magic. I think that at every point in some magician's life or witch's life, they've said, I'm going to follow a spell for invisibility to the letter. And then they're like, why didn't it work? What did I do wrong? Like, why does God hate me? Or maybe this magic stuff is bunk, and you go on and you do something else, but whatever. But this is the nod to the Heptameron. This is the nod to Agrippa. This is the nod to the Christian cult having to categorize everything and jam it into a table. But 'twill soon be the hour of Venus, and her day Friday. Make the figurine of wax, and write the spell on the skin of a toad. And I asked, why a toad? And the reason why is because toads go to the underworld. And so if you want something to happen, especially something to happen coming from the underworld and growing back up into this world, the overworld, you would write it on the skin of the toad and then let the toad out. And so you're not making toad paper, okay? He probably took a toad, flipped it over on its back, and literally wrote the spell or the sigil on it, and then turned it loose, and that toad, being freaked out, burrowed into the mud and sent the message to the underworld. And the same thing happens with birds. The reason why we see birds so many times at weddings and for divination and literally augury is because birds themselves are messengers to the heaven. They carry your prayers to heaven. And so if you want things to happen in this world, if you want things to move up, because everything moves up, right? You would write it on a toad, the toad goes into the underworld, the message gets delivered, the toad comes back up to the overworld, and that puts it in our world. And when you send things to heaven, that's when you light incense, that's when you turn out birds, those sorts of things. These all have very practical pagan observations on them, even though we see them in other religions. Anyway, thus do we witches, ever bearing in mind that invisibility is not a lack of sight in all beholders, but a lack of observation. But any blind may see, but he who carries the spell is not marked by all about him. Your witchcraft, it seems, is very much a thing of the mind and the dominance of the witch's mind over her surroundings. So you're not going to literally become invisible and then go, whatever, steal a pair of shoes or something like that, whatever you want to do. You're just not going to be marked by those around them. The physical world exists, and it's really the world that we should start with, but witches are smart enough to know that there's a soul, that there's an intellectualism, there's more to it than just the physical world. Truly a thing of much accurate observation and knowledge of what people do and may do certain events. The witch holds the mind of those she would influence. 'Tis simple. An old woman with a load may become and go unnoticed, so long as her behavior is that of an old woman with a load. In other words, there's sympathetic magic here again. So long as you act like an old woman with a load, nobody's going to pay attention to you. So if she hurry or stop to glance about her, she would be marked. Yes, always one so disguised wears the charm of the talisman with such confidence that she knows none may note her. There's mind games going on here. When you cast a spell, you need to be sure it comes true. You need to not have any modicum of doubt in you. As she sees herself in her own mind, so do others see her. But if she trusts not in the powers that she wears, if she trusts not in the power that she has, and lets fear taint her mind, then does she impart fear into those about her. They see her furtiveness, mark her, remember her, question her, and take her. So it's not just somebody notices you. It's if you're nervous, you're projecting that. That's one of the responsibilities of being a witch, right? So that's how spells work. That's Gerald Gardner, basically telling us a secret. Tur is a mystic, so Tur does end up going off into mysticism, and Tur's mysticism is putting him in a state of ultimate reception, and Gardner acknowledges this also. The church denounced what Tur was doing, declaring it to be sinful and punishable by death and forbidden by God. Yet it was God who was aiding Tur. Yen knew that Tur was not working through the devil, as the church said all sorcerers worked, because one cannot invoke the devil in God's sacred name. And so they may not care what those Christian names of God are around the circle. They just view the circle as a protective measure. And if the God's name keeps those enemies of God away, put it on there. Why not? It's something to use as a pagan, right? That evil would surely blast a man where he stood. No, Tur had worked through God with the utmost reverence, and God had answered his prayers. So clearly it was God's will. In the creation of Bartzabel, Yen saw the hand of God as the answer to the solemn prayer. So a sincere and solemn prayer and the practice of asceticism does actually cause magic to work. It's one of the paths of magic, right? Tur, as a mystic, doesn't really understand what he's doing or why the magic works, merely that it does. However, in doing so, he acts outside of both the Coven and the Church. He acts outside of the established cycles and the passing of the power. Tur's mysticism is a divine providence, where the gods love Tur so much that they will work with him individually. Tur does not approach this through intellectualism, but through mysticism. Tur is appealing to God. He's putting himself in a state of reception and penitence. You see this a lot when you talk about Enochian and John Dee. And that's how that particular strain of magic works. There's not just one strain of magic. Now, the fertility cult, often imitated and unfortunately duplicated. At this point, I hope we understand there's more than one path that religion has gone. There's more than one path in Europe that we're given, right? But everybody's copying the homework of the fertility cult, right? The fertility cult sometimes copies their homework. That's how the Hebrew names of God ended up on the circle. But they started it. They started copying our homework. So again, we're given Christ as a come lately on page 4 of the book. We've kind of jumped back. I see Yen, dejectedly. He had based all his hopes on Tur and now found him a broken reed. But Tur, is there no way at all? I fear not. To risk my life, must I, as the monks say, sell my soul. This is the peasant's approach to Christianity. Ooh, if I do bad things, I'm going to hell, right? The political Christianity. That is but a priestly lie, says Tur. The God whom the magicians invoke is the same one that the monks pray to, but we're taught to pray differently. Again, it's totally okay if you want to put Hebrew names of God on your circle to put Hebrew names of God on your circle. There's other things that Wiccans do. There's other things that other people do if they're a different religion. But the circle is the fundamental force. It is the paganism. They're copying our stuff. And continued Tur, it was so done. But in time came certain Babylonian philosophers who dug out the sepulchre, again Freemasonry, and they made copies of the key, and with them worked many marvels. Freemasonry and Solomonic ritual, right? They're saying they stole our homework. The fertility cult, the ancient mystery, serves as the foundation of all other mysteries and its cycles, right? We all go back to that fertility cult. Crowley has some commentary on here also. Here would be no temptation, no distraction for him in the beauty unadorned, because a magus must be immune to such conditions, ere he may become a magus, for if he cannot at all times prevent his mind from straying, failure in his enterprises would be inevitable. Rather was such nudity an added strength to him, for by its presence it signifies the strength of his will and the power of his self-control. For a magus must ever work with a naked woman till nudity is naught to him, lest an evil or mischievous spirit should appear thus and distract his mind at a critical moment and so ruin the operation. This is Crowley writing this. There's no doubt in my mind that if it's not, Gardner read some Crowley because he had that OTO charter and they were good friends, and he probably had the rituals of the OTO. And this is Crowley writing this. Crowley really, he did things to excess until they held no power over him. Whether it was drugs, whether it was women, whether it was wine, that was just how he operated. And there's a certain asceticism to that, where you hit a point where nothing excites you anymore and nothing is interesting anymore. And I think that Crowley had to deal with that. But I find it interesting that there's this nod to asceticism, and you could very comfortably put this entire paragraph into, book 4 or the Book of Lies, and it fits in there very nicely. This is describing asceticism, but more importantly, it's describing the breaking the cycle of movement, rebirth, and change. Asceticism is somebody becoming static and eternal because they are static. Instead of putting things in motion, it slows them down and chokes them out. It is Christianity as a political yoke, right? It is poison to the fertility cult, as sexual arousal is no more a thing. If you do go down that ascetic path, you're going to have to be prepared for, what that entails. I don't know that that's something that I want to do. It's why I'm not a mystic sitting in a cave somewhere. Yeah. Gardner starts editorializing towards the end here. In fact, this is the very next page. It is the fashion today to laugh at the magus and his pretensions, to picture him as either a charlatan or a doddering old fool, and bearing the slightest resemblance to the men who were in fact the scientists of the day, who gave us alcohol but not the atom bomb. And of course we can compare that to Ben Franklin, who says God gives us beer because they love us and they want us to be happy. I mean, those are sorts of the thoughts. Crowley on the robe, especially if you think about the last slide, he says that the function of the robe in Book 4, when he's describing the neophyte, is to insulate the neophyte from the elements as they might be a distraction. And I think that's very different from how witches operate, where we want to embrace the elements. We want to be part of it. We want to be acknowledging our place in the universe and our interaction with the cycles, right? Gardner, when he's editorializing here, I mean, this is also true. This is wisdom from the pagan cult. I mean, think about how many problems in society that social media causes, whether things are taken out of context or misquoted or anything like that. These are misuses of technology which really harm us. And if we had kept our mind on the beauty of fertility and the dignity of the soul, we wouldn't have these issues. We wouldn't be building awful things or doing awful things to each other. I mean, if we want to quote Christ, love thy neighbor. So it is what it is. It's unfortunate. I think that it's another place where if people just went outside and touched grass, the world might be a better place, right? So that's our last slide. Thank you for watching my video. Hopefully it didn't bore anybody to death. It came in at just over an hour, but that's because we didn't have the audience interaction, even with the parts that I put back in. But the slide deck will be linked there. If not, pause it, write down these email addresses. Feel free to send me an email. I don't really care. On my blog, I don't write anymore. I felt like I was giving away too many secrets and there was too much of that risk. But I do try to produce videos for pagans if you're interested in Gardnerian witchcraft, or you're interested in magic. But there's the material on High Magic's Aid, Part 1 and 2. A lot of the material would be duplicated here in the video. Hopefully you enjoyed the narration. There's all the times Gardner mentioned fertility. There's about 200 times where he mentions fertility. He just hammers that point home. It's a fertility cult, it's a fertility cult, it's a fertility cult. That's Gardnerian Wicca. Books, High Magic's Aid, released on Amazon. Recently got reprinted by Kristen Dales. Got the permission from the copyright holder to reprint it. And so a lot of Gardner's material is either expired copyright or it's essentially locked behind copyright where it can't be reprinted. She took the time to actually get it legally reprinted, and there's now a hardbound volume on Amazon, so you can click that link. Hamlet's Mill was given to me by some fellow in the craft who I think is very smart. I respect him a lot. I enjoy talking to him every time we hang out. We don't see him often enough because he lives a little bit of a drive away. But Hamlet's Mill goes all the way back to antiquity and makes the same arguments here. It really gave the bones to this presentation about measurement and the passage of time and the fertility cult and all the rest of it. There's also The Roots of Witchcraft by Michael Harrison. I've tried to give this copy to everybody who's willing to put up with me. There we go. If you're a pagan and you get initiated, or if you're just a pagan, you'll get it as a gift from me. If you're just a pagan, you want to check it out, you'll have to find it on eBay. I bought it at a gas station driving to Maine because I was bored. I don't know why it had a copy there, but it did, and I bought it for the cover. It was just like, look, Satan, we're gonna do this. It turned out to be a really good book, and it quotes Gerald Gardner. There's a lot of like wink wink nods nudges in there for Gardnerians, but it's a good read just by itself. It's really fascinating. So anyway, this has been an hour. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. If you want more content like this, maybe I'll make more videos, maybe not, I don't know. But if you know a Gardnerian and you happen to be in the Mid-Atlantic region and you're a seeker or something, post to Facebook, reach out via email, something like that. There's groups on Facebook that we can hook you up with. There's email lists. There's local covens. You know, we know everybody in the area and we talk and we're on good terms. They're all quality people who I keep in touch with. And if you're just a pagan and you stumbled upon this video or somebody sent you the video, I hope that you learned something. I hope that you decided that Gardnerian craft is right for you, or Gardnerian craft isn't right for you and you want to do something else. I hope that you got something out of it in terms of those decisions to make, and if you wanted to be a part of this, and I hope that you understand it better. So, blessed be.